Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the money in your wallet is worth half of what it was yesterday. Not because of inflation, not because of a stock market crash, but because the rest of the world, quietly, deliberately, without asking your permission, decided they no longer needed it. That's not a hypothetical. That's not a doomsday fantasy. That is exactly what happened to the British pound in 1956. And the people who saw it coming were laughed at, right up until the moment they weren't. Right now, in 2025, something is moving beneath the surface of the global financial system. Something most people can't see because they're not looking in the right places. The headlines talk about interest rates, stock prices, and quarterly earnings, but the real story, the one that will reshape the next 50 years of economic history, isn't happening on Wall Street. It's happening in Moscow, in Beijing, in Riyadh, and in Brasilia. 4 countries, 4 separate moves, one shared goal: to end the dollar's reign as the world's reserve currency. Now, before you roll your eyes, before you say people have been predicting the dollar's death for decades, I want you to stay with me, because this time the evidence isn't theoretical. The deals have already been signed, the infrastructure is already being built, and the timelines are no longer measured in decades, they're measured in years. Here's what a reserve currency actually means and why losing that status would be the most devastating economic event in American history. When the dollar became the world's reserve currency in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, it wasn't just a financial decision, it was a structural decision. It meant that oil, the lifeblood of every modern economy, had to be bought in dollars. It meant that when a country in Southeast Asia wanted to trade with a country in South America, they did it in dollars. It meant that the United States could print money, export that inflation to the rest of the world, and pay its debts with currency that other nations were forced to hold. That privilege, economists call it the exorbitant privilege, is worth trillions of dollars every single year. And it is the only reason the United States can carry $34 trillion in debt without the financial system collapsing overnight. Now, what happens when that privilege disappears? What happens when the world no longer needs dollars to buy oil? When international trade settles in a different currency? When central banks around the world, quietly, slowly, start replacing their dollar reserves with something else? You're about to find out. Because the 4 countries I'm going to show you tonight aren't planning this. They aren't debating it in committee rooms. They are already doing it. And the most unsettling part? The U.S. government knows. The Federal Reserve knows. And so far, the response has been almost silence. Stay with me, because part 2 is where we reveal the first country and the single trade deal that sent shockwaves through Washington that the mainstream media almost completely ignored. In March 2023, something happened that would have been front-page news in any other era of history. It barely got 3 paragraphs. China, for the first time ever, completed a liquefied natural gas trade with France, settled entirely in Chinese yuan. Not dollars, yuan. It happened through the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange. It was quiet, it was efficient, and it was a signal so loud that anyone who understood its meaning felt a chill run down their spine. Because here's what most people don't understand about China's strategy. They're not trying to replace the dollar overnight. That's not the plan. The plan is something far more patient, far more calculated, and frankly, far more dangerous. China has spent the last 15 years building an alternative financial architecture, piece by piece, block by block. First came the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, a direct competitor to SWIFT, the messaging network that underpins almost every international dollar transaction on Earth. CIPS now processes trillions of dollars in transactions every year, except none of it is in dollars. Then came the digital yuan, the ECNY, a central bank digital currency that China has already rolled out to hundreds of millions of citizens and is now offering to foreign trading partners as a payment alternative. Then came the gold. Between 2022 and 2024, China added more gold to its reserves than in the previous decade combined. The People's Bank of China bought gold for 18 consecutive months. Why does that matter? Because historically, nations accumulate gold when they're preparing to back a new monetary system. That's not conspiracy, that's history. And then, most critically, came the petrodollar threat. Saudi Arabia, the kingdom that made the original deal with Nixon in 1974 to sell all its oil exclusively in US dollars. The deal that created the petrodollar system. The deal that gave the United States its grip on global energy markets for half a century. In 2023, Saudi Arabia publicly announced it was open to settling oil trades in currencies other than the dollar. Let that sink in. The country that built the petrodollar system just said it's open for business in yuan. And here's where it gets deeply uncomfortable. China isn't doing this alone. The LNG deal with France wasn't just a bilateral transaction. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration to every other nation on Earth that dollar-free energy trade is not only possible, it's already happening. The question that should keep you up at night isn't whether China can pull this off. The question is, how far along is it already? And the answer, which the mainstream financial press is almost allergic to saying out loud, is further than most Americans realize. But China is just country one. Country two? It's the one that was locked out of the dollar system entirely and responded by building something that may outlast the dollar itself.
When you cut someone off completely, when you take away every option, every exit, every off-ramp, you don't destroy them. Sometimes you innovate them. In February 2022, the United States and its allies did something unprecedented. They froze Russia's foreign currency reserves, approximately $300 billion held in Western financial institutions, overnight. It was the financial equivalent of a nuclear option. The message was clear. Step out of line, and we will simply turn off your access to the global dollar system. What happened next is the part no one in Washington wanted to see. Russia didn't collapse. It adapted. Within months, Russia had rerouted its energy exports through alternative channels. It began demanding payment for oil and gas in rubles and yuan. It deepened its financial ties with China, India, Iran, and Turkey, nations that either couldn't or wouldn't follow Western sanctions to the letter. And then Russia did something that stunned financial analysts who were paying close attention. It announced that the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, would begin exploring a new joint reserve currency, one backed not by the full faith and credit of any single government, but potentially by a basket of commodities, gold, oil, and agricultural products. The announcement was widely mocked in Western financial circles. It isn't being mocked anymore. Because here's what the sanctions on Russia inadvertently proved to every nation on Earth, including every nation that still considered itself a U.S. ally. Your dollar reserves can be taken from you. Not through war, not through negotiation, with the stroke of a pen. That realization landed like a depth charge in the boardrooms of central banks from Lagos to Jakarta. If it could happen to Russia, the world's largest country, a nuclear power, a major energy supplier, it could happen to anyone. The freezing of Russian reserves didn't just punish Russia. It advertised the dollar system's greatest weakness to the entire world. And nations began quietly, systematically asking themselves the same question. How do we make sure this never happens to us? The answer, increasingly, is the same. Reduce dollar exposure, accumulate gold, build bilateral trade agreements in local currencies, and watch very carefully what BRICS does next. Russia's exclusion from the dollar system didn't end its economic influence. It created a blueprint, a manual for dollar independence that is now being studied and implemented by governments on 5 continents. But Russia and China, as powerful as they are, don't complete this picture alone. There is a third country, one that most Western analysts completely underestimate. A nation of 1.4 billion people sitting on the world's fastest-growing economy, one that has made a decision so quiet, so methodical, and so strategically brilliant that by the time most people notice it, it will already be irreversible. Country 3 is India. And what India is doing right now is not what you think.
India has never been a nation that makes loud declarations. It doesn't need to. For decades, India played a careful diplomatic game, staying close to the United States without ever fully committing, buying Russian weapons while attending American summits, importing Iranian oil through back channels while maintaining friendly relations with Washington. The West called it strategic ambiguity. India called it survival. But something shifted starting in 2022, and it wasn't subtle if you knew where to look. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the US and its European allies expected India to fall in line, to condemn Russia, to join the sanctions, to cut off trade. India did none of those things. Instead, India dramatically increased its purchases of Russian oil, buying it at massive discounts while the rest of the world looked away. By 2023, Russia had become India's single largest oil supplier, and almost none of that oil was paid for in dollars. It was paid for in rupees, dirhams, and yuan. This wasn't reckless. It wasn't defiance for the sake of defiance. It was a calculated economic decision by a government that had watched what happened to Russia's dollar reserves and decided, quietly, that it would never allow itself to be that vulnerable. But here's where India's role becomes truly pivotal and why it terrifies Western economists more than Russia or China combined. India is not an adversary of the United States. It's a partner, a democracy, a nation with deep cultural, educational, and economic ties to the West. And that is precisely the problem. Because if India, a friendly nation, a strategic ally, a member of the Quad Security Alliance, if India is moving away from dollar dependency, then the dollar's decline isn't just a story about hostile powers seeking revenge. It's a story about the entire world, friends and enemies alike, rationally, economically, independently concluding that the dollar system no longer serves their interests the way it once did. India is now pushing for the Indian rupee to be used in international trade settlements. It has signed rupee trade agreements with over 18 countries. The Reserve Bank of India has been accumulating gold at a record pace, and India's own digital currency, the digital rupee, is being piloted for cross-border transactions. The world's most populous nation, the world's fastest-growing major economy, is quietly, methodically building the infrastructure to operate outside the dollar system. And it's doing it while attending G7 meetings and shaking hands in Washington. That's not betrayal, that's pragmatism. The fourth country, though, this is the one that almost no one is watching. Not Russia, not China, not India. It's a country that most Americans couldn't point to on a map. But what it's doing in the Arabian desert right now could be the move that finally breaks the petrodollar system that has underwritten American economic dominance for 50 years. The fourth country is Saudi Arabia, and the deal it almost made would have changed everything. In 2023, the Wall Street Journal published a story that briefly caused panic in the U.S. Treasury Department. Saudi Arabia was in active negotiations to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the geopolitical alliance led by China and Russia. It didn't happen, at least not fully, not yet. But the fact that it was on the table, that the kingdom which built the petrodollar system was seriously considering membership in a China-led bloc, tells you everything you need to know about where we are. The Saudis haven't abandoned the dollar, but they have made something crystal clear to Washington. The relationship that Nixon and Kissinger forged in 1974, oil for security, priced in dollars, is no longer unconditional. The Saudis are accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases. They're building financial infrastructure with BRICS members. They invited China's President Xi to Riyadh with an honor rarely extended to foreign leaders. And behind closed doors, they are hedging. Quietly, deliberately. So here's where we stand. China is building a parallel financial system and proving it works, one yuan settled trade at a time. Russia, after being cut off from the dollar system, created a living case study of how to survive, and others are following the blueprint. India, the world's largest democracy and one of America's closest strategic partners, is diversifying away from the dollar as fast as it responsibly can. And Saudi Arabia, the keystone of the entire petrodollar architecture, is openly entertaining alternatives for the first time in half a century. These are not predictions. These are not theories. These are documented, verifiable, current events. Now, what does this mean for you? If the dollar loses its reserve currency status, even partially, the United States loses the ability to run deficits the way it currently does. The cost of imports rises, the cost of borrowing rises, and the purchasing power of every dollar you earn, every dollar you've saved, every dollar sitting in your retirement account, quietly, irreversibly, shrinks. It won't happen in a single day. Reserve currency transitions take years, sometimes decades. But once the momentum starts, once the tipping point is crossed, history shows it doesn't reverse. The British pound's decline began in 1914. By 1956, it was finished. That's 42 years, and we may already be 10 years into ours. The people who protect themselves in these transitions are not the ones who panic. They're not the ones who dismiss the warning signs either. They're the ones who understand what's happening, take deliberate steps to diversify their financial exposure, and stop assuming that the system that worked for their parents will work for their children. Physical assets, alternative currencies, reduced dollar dependency and personal savings. These are not radical ideas. They are the same moves that smart money and smart governments are making right now. The question isn't whether the world is changing. The question is whether you'll be ready when it does.